David Foss comes to us as a member of the House of Lords, the former Brexit chief negotiator, a Daily Telegraph columnist. He's ran his early professional career in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, becoming ambassador to Denmark.
Yes.
EU director at the FCO and director for Europe and the International Trade at the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills. Briefly, he sat in the cabinet as Minister for the Cabinet Office. And from this month, you're now the new director to the Institute of Economic Affairs. I think you've begun work last week, so. Which is, I believe, Britain's oldest think tank.
Probably oldest. Yeah.
And you've also spoken in the Lords against the Assisted Dying Bill, notably. I first got to know David as a listener to the podcast Irreverent that I and a couple of other vicars have put together. And he sent us a very gracious email saying how much he appreciated the podcast during the lockdowns and beyond. That when you left government, we grabbed the opportunity. So, well, that's such a nice email. Why don't we invite him on as a guest? And you came on our show. Our last year, I know that in your journey, you returned to faith, that your seed being confirmed into the Catholic Church. You're a prolific commentator on the political sphere. But I know that you're here tonight, particularly to lean into the journey of faith. And to talk about that as well, and particularly, there'll come a point where we will we'll open the floor to questions, and we'll conclude around about 8:30. Please, ladies and gentlemen, do give a big hand to our guest speaker today, our first guest speaker, Lord David Foss.
Well, fantastic. Thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you, everybody, for turning out on such a miserable, cold night. I really appreciate it, and I'm very honoured that you've done so. We have planned, Daniel and I, that I will talk for about 10 minutes with a few thoughts, and then we're going to have a discussion that will lead into questions to sort of open things out a little bit. So these really are just a few introductory remarks, I guess, to set out a few thoughts of my own. Now, I think British politics is going through quite an unusual period and has been for a few years now. But I think if there's one thing that I think is common to almost every strand of British political opinion at the moment, and perhaps every voter, it's the sense of that things are a bit unsettled, and the sense of the sands are moving beneath our feet in some way. And I certainly feel that many of the certainties that shaped the life of the country, the national identity, the inherited moral framework, all our understandings of what make a society are, to say the least, coming under strain. And I think that is part of the reason why we're seeing what Daniel alluded to at the start, which is the quiet revival and people looking for something different. Now, as a politician, I obviously look at these things in somewhat political ways. And I think as you start asking these questions, you inevitably ask yourself as a politician some particular ones. So what is the relationship between faith and politics? Can a nation survive without some sort of shared religious, cultural assumptions drawn from religion at least? And if not, what happens when Christianity withdraws, as it to quite a large extent already has, from public life? So I'll offer a few thoughts on all of that. But first, why am I commenting on this at all? Well, like many of my generation, I was a Christian at university, but drifted away when I started to work. And for decades, I remained on the periphery, I guess, of Christianity, interested, but never fully involved. And then came the lockdowns of 2020. And those strange months forced me to think hard, and I don't think I was the only one, as all that was solid about presumptions about one's existence seemed to kind of melt away into air, and everything we got used to disappeared at the snap of a finger. And for me, at least, I felt something malign seemed to have been released into society in that time, with a collapse of contact between people, the closure of the churches, and the atmosphere of fear that prevailed at times in that period. And I felt something was happening that I couldn't quite name, left me feeling there was more to life than just kind of getting on with the job and daily existence. And luckily at that point, and for me at least, so I believe it was divine providence, I discovered your podcast, Daniel, and colleagues, and that helped me put some of these thoughts into words. Over the subsequent 5 years, I went on a genuine journey. I'm sure we'll talk a bit about it, but for me, the main thing was a discovery or rediscovery that intelligent people could take Christianity seriously, not as a sort of nostalgia or cultural artifact, but as a living truth with a properly supernatural dimension that explained reality better than the other alternatives. And that was the discovery that took me on this journey that entered into being received into the Roman Catholic Church at Easter this year. Now, for me, the effect has, of course, been primarily personal, or at least I hope it has, and I hope the people around me might say that. But of course, it has had an influence on my politics as well. And as I said, as a Christian politician, you're drawn to think about to what extent Christianity shapes your own political positions, and to what extent you should make them that fact explicit when you're doing politics. And really, to anticipate what I'm going to say in these few minutes, first, I believe the withdrawal of Christianity as a meaningful element in the public governance of this country is a problem. Second, the politicians and others in public life who are Christians ought to be ready to say a bit more how that affects their positions. And finally, I think if they are to have traction and to be taken seriously, they need to do so not in a sort of accommodationist way as a kind of add-on to secular concerns, but give the sort of full-fat version, or at least be ready to kind of acknowledge it, even if you don't always talk about it. So just to go into a little bit more detail, it's obvious this country and others in Christendom, for want of a better term, have been fundamentally shaped by Christianity, and I'm sure many of us have seen, if not read, the very interesting book last year by Bijan Omrani on this subject, and is part of our cultural assumptions, history, culture, calendar, art, architecture, so much of this country. Now, I think it's unarguable that that legacy exists, but it's not being built on anymore. And indeed, over recent decades, I think we and others convinced ourselves we could afford to move away from all of this and try to construct a neutral public space, and a space where philosophical convictions were entirely secular and where religion retreated into private life. And the idea, of course, was that this neutral public space would produce genuine pluralism and tolerance. And of course, to a very large extent, it did just that. And that's certainly not an ignoble aim. After the horrors of the wars of religion, it was and is understandable that religious beliefs should be something that we don't fight about. But I don't think that means that you have to force Christianity or religion out of the public square entirely to deal with that problem. Yet that is what we've actually seen. What's happened is that as Britain, with Christianity as a core component of its national identity, has gradually disappeared, we've in parallel dismantled much else, not just the religious norms, but everything connected to them, the history, the national identity, shared culture and community. And I think we've managed that to the extent we have managed it, because for a long time society was running on the fumes of Christianity, as it was for much of the 19th and 20th century, I guess, and we could manage those consequences because a lot of the shared assumptions remained. But now that is being exhausted. Christianity is becoming a kind of fleeting memory to many of the younger generation, I think, in Britain. It's disappearing. And what we're seeing is not nothing, of course. We're seeing other ideas and belief systems beginning to fill the gap that is now vacated. It's not a neutral space. It's still a contested space. It's just a different kind of space. Because the need for belief and communal bonds in society doesn't disappear. Something always picks this up. There always has to be ideologies of one kind or another. And for this reason, I think the idea of a genuinely neutral public realm is a bit of an illusion, really, and we should kind of acknowledge that. Now, looking at the country now, what is filling the gap that's been left? Well, there are a few things, and I won't go into detail. One obvious one is Islam. That is a feature of public life in Britain in a ways it wasn't 50 years ago. I think there is another ideology that is bubbling up, which is, almost pre-Christian, sort of quasi-Nietzschean pagan beliefs about race, ethno-nationalism, the sort of strong men in society. We're beginning to see bits of this now, and it's a very troubling sign, in my view. We're obviously seeing kind of wokeism, for want of a better word, a belief that society is about kind of groups and identities, and you can kind of make this up a bit as you go along. And I think we're also seeing what I see a lot of, but almost goes without comment, which is a kind of deadening secularism and utilitarianism in the public space. And I think actually it's that ideology that is winning out in many ways at the moment. Now, some see that as kind of simply a neutrality and not a belief system in itself. I disagree with that. I think utilitarianism, secular utilitarianism, is a worldview in its own right. It's one that brings the kind of numerical calculus, the cost-benefit balance, economic analysis from areas where it's appropriate, such as economics, business, commercial life, to areas where it's completely inappropriate, areas which come right to the fundamentals of human existence as people and individuals. And I think there are many cases where you can see this, but I see it at the moment in the issue that Daniel mentioned, the assisted suicide legislation. And what we're being asked to do here is to override a fundamental presumption of hitherto accepted morality, to make up ethics as we go along, if you like, and to overturn inherited moral prohibitions when they've become inconvenient to people. And if you're a utilitarian, why not? You look at the cost benefits and you come to certain conclusions. The problem is, of course, what protection does anybody have once you go down that road? What prevents that logic from extending further if when you're old or disabled or just kind of inconvenient in some way? And, we've already seen people being willing to argue the case that if human beings have no inherent dignity, if we're just sort of arrangements of matter, then economic calculation becomes perfectly rational. If the elderly are a drain on resources, then why not? The logic is consistent. The only thing stopping people from endorsing it fully, or many people, is this sort of lingering Christian conviction that perhaps they haven't fully acknowledged, still persists, still shapes. But as I say, that is fading fast. So I very much fear this sort of deadening secular utilitarianism that we are seeing, and I see quite a bit of it in the Lords when we're debating these issues. Now, of course, no one has taken my view on this subject. I fear that direction of travel, but of course, it's something to be debated. The trouble is that my view against all this is often not heard in the mainstream. It's felt to be wrong, illegitimate somehow to bring the transcendent, the religious, the supernatural into public debate. And the only things you can bring into public space are secular values. And I think one of the important things, as I said at the start, that Christian politicians can do is not acquiesce in this, in the view that Christianity is part of private conscience, but not to be brought into the public square. And I think it's for Christian politicians to give a lead in this, and help others kind of follow. Politics is, I think, sort of downstream of culture, yes, but also ultimately of metaphysics. And the deepest political questions aren't really political ones, they're ultimate ones. The prior questions of, what is human being? How do we guide our life? What is the nature of ultimate reality? And those are theological questions. If we don't allow ourselves to bring Christian answers to those questions into politics, then we're not removing metaphysics. We're simply allowing others' metaphysics to occupy the field. So that's why I think it's really important. And I acknowledge I've not been good at this, but I will aim to be in future. Bring Christianity and Christian beliefs into the debate. It brings me to my final point, and I'll wrap up. If we do bring these issues into politics, we must do so in a form that's kind of compelling, interesting, and meaningful. And it's not just a kind of Christian religious dressing for essentially secular politics, whether that's at the right or of the left. I think the only way you're going to grab people's attention in future is by unashamed justification of beliefs on the basis of a transcendent belief system. I think only this has got the kind of explanatory power and compelling power to occupy properly a space in this kind of battle of ideas, if you like. And again, I think politicians have a duty to say this when it's the moment to do so, not to kind of bang on about it like an American televangelist, but to acknowledge it and be willing to speak about it. And I guess I would say this, wouldn't I? And one would expect it of the Pope. But I thought that his remarks to ambassadors last week, which are on the Vatican website, of course, a very interesting way of trying to bring some of this into, kind of political discussions on issues. A very interesting tone. I would say the same should be true of the church, of course. And when the church does politics, it ought to, be full fat about it. Why listen to the church if you're only getting a kind of watered down version of secular politics? There has to be something different in it. So I'll finish there. Thank you for listening so patiently. And really what I've tried to say to conclude is that we're not going to have good politics, healthy politics, proper debate if we try to disconnect it and float free from these deeper debates about what reality is and what a human being is and what principles we're operating on. And if Christianity withdraws from the public space, this is really my fundamental point, it doesn't leave neutrality, it leaves space that others move into. And we as Christians have to move into that, I think, have to offer a Christian sort of metaphysics, not nostalgia and not like decorative language for other politics, but as a living account of reality, and try and do that with seriousness, with charity, and bring that to the public debate and try and stabilize some of those shifting sands that I spoke of at the start. Thank you very much.
The thing that struck me as you were talking was I wondered if on the journey you'd found compatriots, people in public life, people in the workplace who was saying to you, yeah, I think I'm having the same sort of thoughts or feelings, or had this been somewhat of a lonely journey?
I mean, I think probably there are more Christians in Parliament than there are kind of in society more broadly, or people are willing to acknowledge it. I don't know. Maybe that's just an age thing as much as anything else, but I think it's the case. All the same, people kind of keep it to themselves. And I found myself kind of, as I took political positions on things like abortion, for example, you sort of drifted into circles where you found other Christians, and that I began to pick it up. And there are some fellowships in Parliament, but my kind of thought process, I suppose, was my own. I didn't feel particularly encouraged. I just felt a kind of group to go to. rather than the group that was pulling me along, if you see what I mean.
And I wonder sort of broadly as well, because I've seen this over the last decade, that, you go into pubs and cafes, and whereas talking about faith, religion, the transcendent would have got you shut down quite quickly. I don't know, I feel that there's a lot more openness to those conversations. We had a build-around that filled around the vicarage recently, redoing some of the bottom decking. And he sort of got his fag and his cup of coffee, and he says, Vicar, if you'd have asked me 10 years ago, I'd have said all this God stuff is a load of beep, 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 beep. But now I think you guys are onto something. Yeah? And I get those conversations more and more across the age range, often, and not because I'm just working in a university setting, but certainly amongst a younger generation. Those conversations don't feel as intimidating. And you start to begin to, after a while, think, oh yes, you're having those thoughts too, quite quickly. And it's there, it's present, isn't it?
I think something is definitely happening. I mean, obviously, we're all in our own bubble to some extent, and it's important to aim off for him. But that Quiet Revival report last year, the Bible Society did, does suggest that something is going on. I would say, I think it is easier in politics than it used to be to bring your belief system, to bring Christianity into it. I think 10 years ago, it would have seemed pretty jarring in Parliament start talking about it, and really quite eccentric.
Alistair Campbell famously said, "We don't do God."
Yeah, exactly. And now it's that seems a bit eccentric. I think some of that's kind of wider. Religion is a part of public debate in a way that it wasn't, 10, 20, 30 years ago. At the global level, people can see that religions of different kinds are a powerful motivating force. So that makes brings it into the public debate. But even so, I really think that, and I've heard it from a lot of people, that the pandemic, triggered something in a lot of people that and just made them question a lot of presumptions, and I think that sort of knocking away of everything you'd come to expect has been quite important in what's going on.
Well, only last month I missed the bus back to the other campus at night, and it was like tonight, very, very wet, and so I thought I'll wait out there for the bus, and this couple come round the corner I've never seen before, in their I would say late 20s, and I was wearing my clerical shirt, and I was a vicar. Yeah, look, a vicar. Do you know, she's been talking about God, and so have I, all week. And there you are. And we it's we just can't stop talking about it. And I had a 10-minute pastoral sort of chat with them, and I'm finding that more and more, that folks are really up for those conversations. There's a curiosity, and yes, there's a sense in which something in the lockdown, maybe a little bit before that as well. I think the New Atheist project seemed to be collapsing in its own weight. But there is a something happening. There's a something in the air that doesn't seem to be cooling down. It doesn't seem to be a blip. It seems to be expanding at the moment.
Yes, I definitely think it's there. It's definitely more possible to talk about this, and it just doesn't feel so jarring. And when I talk about some of the things that, some of the specifics on my journey, I find people kind of listen with interest. And I mean, to take one example, one of the things that made me kind of drift away from the church in my 20s was I did a lot of theological reading and so on. And I took from that, this was the mid to late 80s, that the Gospels were essentially documents you couldn't really put any reliance on, that they'd not exactly been made up, but they were sort of like gobbets of things people remembered, and then they'd kind of filtered them through their prior beliefs and cobbled them all together, and you really couldn't place any belief. That seemed to be like the accepted view. And I come back to this sort of 30, 40 years later, and it turns out there's been a complete revolution in the way theologians look at this, and there's much more belief, there's much more good evidence for the Gospels being essentially reliable accounts of what happened to a large extent by eyewitnesses. And there's all sorts of particular points one could point to that suggests this. And when I talk about this, if I get the opportunity to talk about this, people say, gosh, that's interesting. I never realized that, you could take these sort of seriously as historical documents telling you something, and there's something you can rely on in it.
I think some people online have really run with that, haven't they? And that's now going into the wider world of influencers and that who are picking up on some of this and beginning to stop snarling at Christianity, but give it a serious second look, and they're finding that the scriptures are a profoundly deep document.
Yes, I think I know the New Testament fairly well now. And read bits of it for most of my life and a lot more recently. But I still keep finding bits in it that feel like they're new. And, there'll be the reading in a service, and I'll listen. I think, is that really in the Bible? Why have I not read that before? Is that really there? And I go to it, of course it is there. And I think these are kind of endlessly powerful documents that constantly supply new things to think about, which is what one would expect, and is powerful evidence that they are what they claim to be, in my view.
And you studied, if I remember rightly, medieval history.
Yeah.
So you've got a sort of finger at the pie, so to speak, in this. Have there been particular voices, writers in your faith journey that have really stuck out, that have been helpful companions on the road?
Yeah, I mean, quite a lot, I think, as for everyone, and they've all filled in different bits, I suppose. And I think it depends what sort of person you are, but I'm a kind of intellectual person, I guess, and I come to things by reading and thinking about them, and listening. And certainly for me, Bishop Barron, Robert Barron, and his account of Catholicism, his kind of very intellectual approach to the subject's been really powerful and interesting for me. Who else? People, I mean, at a completely different kind of level, modern writers like Rod Dreher, being very interesting to me. One book I found really powerful was by a woman called Margaret Visser, who is actually primarily a food and cookery writer of 20, 30 years ago, but she was a devout Catholic, practicing Catholic, and she wrote a book about church in Rome, St. Agnes Church in Rome, St. Agnes by the wall, outside the walls, which is incredibly detailed account of this church, where she just kind of walks in and looks at the artifacts, a lot of which obviously go back quite a long way, and just sort of walks through the church, down the nave, to the apse, and then down to the crypt where the bones of St. Agnes still are. And I found this just like, it's an incredibly powerful book because of the kind of relentless detail, the accumulation of ideas, the presentation of this church as an actual artifact in its own right. And what runs through it, of course, is the that St. Agnes was a real person, was a girl who was killed under one of the persecutions and lies there. And I think reading this book for me was one of the first times I really thought, like, these were real people. They're not just kind of names who kind of people leapt on, got made up, got sort of fantasized about, if you like, and built into figures. That they were the real people to whom these things happened, and that's why the church is here. And if you've not read it, I really strongly recommend it. It's a very powerful book. So those are some of the things I would say. There are more, but sometimes, things just kind of strike you. They hit home. They work for you. It won't necessarily have the same effects on others, but for me, those were some of the things.
I remember when New Atheism was at its heights, that the good thing you could say for the Christian church is it sharpened us up intellectually, that we were all trying to make sure that we were going to do a good game, really, when it came to some of the questions that were being thrown at us. But it did sometimes feel it's right-brained, isn't it? Sort of like higher maths. And that there were these, that we were sort of arguing in the sphere of proofs, and it felt very algebraic. But now the conversation, I think, and I wonder if you've seen this also, it seems less logos and more mythos. It's more left brain. It's more about story and encounter and experience, and leaning into the kind of great ocean of wisdom in a kind of creative way. I think that's why people are drawn to some of the great feasts like Christmas and Easter. We've had these record numbers in this country over the last year or so. And people are coming into church buildings as well. Yeah, a lot more is what I'm seeing, to sort of drink it all in. But it's less about, the conversations are less about proving God and more about encountering. Is that, do you think that's a fair?
Yeah, I think, well, you'll have more experience of this than I do, certainly, in the conversations you have. I think it is part of the discussion, of course, and people like Rod Dreher kind of give a voice to this, for the journalistic perspective, I guess. I think it depends on the kind of person you are, and I'm a more intellectual person. Some of this slightly washes over me. Sometimes it really hits home, but it is obviously really, really important. And I think people like Paul Kingsnorth, for example, can really tap into something that is missed through a purely intellectual presentation. That's certainly true.
Yeah, I'd recommend, hopefully over these sessions we can recommend books and things, resources, writers to go and explore. Paul Kingsnorth and Marty Shore are these great storytellers who've recently come to faith, and somehow they've turbocharged their storytelling, and it's connected very powerfully with some of the great biblical stories, and they're kind of resonating with our time. That the story, say for instance, of the narrative of creation and of fall of Adam and Eve is in Kingsnorth and Shore's presentation is not simply something that happened in the past, but is very pertinent now. And the digital, in a way, is kind of accentuating that we're drawn to the forbidden fruits, really, of it. That it is sapping our attention, and we're falling for the same thing that the primordial Adam and Eve have done so. And how easy it will be to look back on them and say, oh, they were just a bit clueless at the time. If only they knew a bit more about things, they'd have seen the trap they were going to fall in. And in fact, it's actually something that's deeply in the psyche of each of us. And this is what the church can deeply offer is a way out of that. I'm also minded that recently a lot of these surveys around the quiet revival indicate a sort of gender disparity, particularly in Gen Z, with young men seemingly to be finding God and voting in a certain way, and women becoming not so kind of keen on the religious and tending more to the left. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on that. I know it's a sweeping generalization, but is there anything in this? Have we become sort of gender polarized, or are we in danger of?
I mean, the polling suggests it a bit. I think it is more acute in the US perhaps than here. I don't know. Some of the polling suggests that it's more young women moving left than young men moving right. So that's how the gap is opening out. And I don't know whether there's anything behind it. I mean, I can't help feeling there's something in the the view that sort of masculinity is unfashionable, and it's difficult for young men to kind of find a role. But I don't. I'm sort of skeptical. That's all of it. And I suppose I fundamentally suspect some of this is short-run responses to short-run kind of politics, rather than necessarily something like fundamental in the way people look at things. And I hope it's a sort of phenomenon that will correct itself and disappear. Let's hope.
And a final question for me is about the church. You intimated about the churches and how the danger is not to speak into what's happening. If there's no bishops here, I don't. But if there was a bishop here, is there something you would give as advice or encouragement?
I mean, I hesitate to judge every bishop by what I see of them in the House of Lords. That's a snapshot, I must admit. But I mean, the Lords is where the kind of the politics and Christianity obviously come closest together if you're a bishop. And I do think that there's tendency to kind of sort of talk about politics and for Christianity to be a sort of add-on. And I think that's a pity. And if bishops can't kind of derive the points they want to make from their religious beliefs, then if they can't do it, then certainly it's going to be more difficult for everybody else. And I do think, I mean, it's a truism really, I think, but if going to church and what's said there is just like the Lib Dems at prayer, then why bother? You could get all of that elsewhere. What you want is something different, and something that's kind of connected to reality. And I just wish this could be communicated a bit more powerfully sometimes, because I mean, I assume they all believe it, and that to find the words for it, we're lucky in the Church of England to have this incredible liturgical verbal tradition that's kind of obviously gone through into the language of every day. The words are there, the power to kind of explain and communicate and compel is given to us, and it's not used quite often, and I really think that's a pity. I think there are people out there who want to hear it, and it just doesn't always come across.
Challenging words. I'm going to open up now to the floor.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was really, really interesting. I'd like to go back to what you said about, you were talking about how you wish that Christians in politics spoke up more, and how you don't want them to be like an American evangelist. I come from quite a different churchmanship. It's a charismatic evangelical church that I go to, and it's in central London. We have a lot of young people. It's grown enormously in the last 10 years, and I think what I've seen amongst the young people in our church is that, and we've talked a lot about changing minds and a cerebral Christianity, and I totally think that's important. But I think I wonder about the heart change that needs to happen in people to actually, for their politics to change, because I've seen so much. Like I've counselled so many young women who perhaps have had abortions in the past, have come to Christ, and now have got a different perspective on human life. And similarly, my own son is a consultant anaesthetist, intensivist, who passionately argues for not for killing off old people. So I just wonder what you think about the heart change that's needed in people, not just a cerebral change. Like you talked about an encounter rather than just knowledge of God.
Gosh, I mean, Daniel, you're probably a better place to answer this sort of question than I am. I think I'm sure you're right. Obviously, that is part of it. The only thing I can contribute perhaps is from my own experience this last few years, when I was kind of reading all these books, and I go to different places, I go to church, so I'd pray, and I was kind of I kept sort of asking, won't you let me experience something, some sort of change, something that will kind of bring me in and can convince me. And I eventually came to the conclusion that that was happening, but it was the pursuit, and the fact was I wasn't able to drop this, and I kept coming back to it, and I kept sort of refusing to ignore the questions. That was in fact the experience, and to me that was what worked. So the change of heart, I think, who knows what one's real change of heart, so rivers, but it can mean different things to different people. I think is the only possible contribution I could give.
I would add that I regularly opened the Bible up for the first time properly at 17, and what came out was from the 5th chapter of St. Luke, love your enemy as yourself. Yeah. And I was looking for a politics. I thought, well, who am I going? I'm going to get my first ballot in a few weeks' time. Who God should I vote for? I'll open the Bible, and there was this very high. I think the highest thing that you could be judged against is the love of adversaries. And I think whatever side of the political fence we're at, or however we operate in the public sphere, a change of heart, I think for me, has to involve that. How am I, not loving my pals or those who are in my social media bubble or the people that, agree with my thoughts, but how can I be compassionate and love my adversaries? And when you see that as the bar, it's a very hard bar, but I think that's the right place to start from, because it constantly, those words of Christ from the sermon, playing the Sermon on the Mount, constantly push us to look at others in a fresh way.
And just to add on that, I think it's really important the church keeps saying challenging things like that. That that it should be saying difficult things and things that seem impossible to do. That's what distinguishes it from ordinary politics. And one example for me, for people sort of broadly on the right of politics, often get irritated by the church as sort of intervening in migration and telling us to welcome migrants. And it is, I think he's right to say that. We should remember that migrants are human beings who deserve exactly the same treatment and dignity, whatever the legality. It doesn't entitle you to behave differently. And I think that's a message, sometimes people on the right find hard to hear, but it does need to be said. And I'm sure there's an equivalent on the left as well. The church has to keep, reminding people what it means to follow Christ, which is to do a lot of seemingly impossible things.
No, I think Christianity, intellectually calls us to not put people in boxes, in categories, but to see each human being as made in the divine image. Each person is particular. Christ wasn't born in the abstract. He was born in Judea and Bethlehem, and a particular person. And I think it's easy to abstract particularly the digital does this. It can actually, I think, erode those compassionate veins. I had a parish priest who trained me and said, when you get to my age, your arteries will harden. When you look at all the, all the people you bump into the parish life. He was joking because he had a fantastic prison ministry. But, we're called to be compassionate in that way. And take the gentleman who had his hand up earlier on the now.
Right. Yeah, thank you very much for the talk. But just, I'm intrigued, what drew you to Roman Catholicism, particularly? Because, yeah.
Yeah. I think, partly it's my kind of sort of intellectual approach to the questions. And, it seemed to me that Roman Catholicism, it kind of was the most obvious representative of the great tradition of going right back to the early church fathers and patristic rites and so on. That it had the Roman Catholic Church had still validated that, preserved it, saw it as part of its day-to-day existence, and that's part of it. And I suppose I also felt that although the Roman Catholicism has had its own difficulties in recent years and, doctrinal wobblings in one or two areas, perhaps you might say. But I still feel that it's the institutional weight of the Catholic Church, the history, size, the tradition means it's more likely to be a reliable preserver of the tradition and the doctrine than other smaller kind of evolved churches. I think that's kind of what I felt. I mean, the Roman Catholic Church is the sort of preeminent, certainly Western institution, arguably global institution as a body, and I think it was that sense that it was you kind of coming home slightly, that it's a reliable guardian of what's important. I'm not saying that others aren't. I'm not kind of making judgments, but I'm just saying that's how it felt to me.
Lord Frost, I wanted to ask you, when you rediscovered your faith, as it were, when you came back to faith, you were talking about declaring your faith in the public square, in political sphere especially. Were you helped in that by people who aren't afraid to declare their faith in the public square? I'm thinking particularly of Danny Kruger, for example, and going back to what the lady across from me was saying. I attend a charismatic evangelical church in Shepherd's Bush, and it's actually the church Danny Kruger and his family attend when they're in London, their London home is in Shepherd's Bush. So yes, were you helped by people like Danny Kruger? I mean, I know there's other MPs in Parliament, I know a couple, but they don't stand up and declare their faith publicly like I would say Danny Kruger does.
No, that's right, and Danny's a good friend, and I haven't talked much about this to him, but he certainly kind of helped me in some of the things he said in his book. were kind of interesting to me as I was thinking through this. So I think, there are and that's why I think it's important. Danny is still a bit unusual. I mean, his famous speech last year in Parliament to the empty house about England and Christianity is still unusual in this, I think, in being quite so upfront about it. Others may bring it in when there's an opportunity, but don't sort of seek an opportunity, perhaps. And I think that's. I know I'm not kind of praising myself. I'm worse than any of them on this, but I'm trying to sort of set to test the things we should try and do. I would say, I mean, I have deliberately not made a thing of kind of coming to Catholicism, and there were a few people who wanted me to write about it and make a thing, and I've hardly talked about it really as such. And in fact, the only other occasion I've done it was on Jamie's Irreverent podcast. And, kind of part of this is because I don't want people to see it as like opportunist or, really what I've been complaining about in others, that it's just a kind of religious veneer over beliefs about Western civilization or whatever that are really the thing. And I don't want to give that impression. This is not the case, and therefore I think it's best not to kind of labour the point in public, which is not the same thing as saying you shouldn't bring it in when the opportunities come up. That's kind of how I should have met it.
It was a very nice talk.
Thank you.
Kind of very interesting. You at some point said that whenever you go to the Bible, you always seem to find something new. My question for both of you actually is, to have a firm belief in God, do you have to have a strong belief in the Bible?
What do you think, Daniel? I mean, I think the answer is probably no, for myself, but it's expanding upon.
I find over time the two intertwine, and that obviously as a child I read the scripture as a child, and now over time that sort of matured, and I found different voices that have enriched my reading of it, and in the scripture is this great sense that, particularly in the New Testament, that we are part of the story too. So, yes, I think you can have a faith that is. I think on one level you could have a sense of God as an abstract idea, a philosophical sense of God, but I think that the scripture calls us to look into real and profound encounters. See, does that?
Yeah, I think. I mean, I say no because obviously, I think. At least some believers in other religions also have an authentic experience of God and the divine. I don't think you can be a very effective or deep Christian, I guess, without engagement with the Bible, and it's sort of central to it. I suppose I would say, and who am I to comment on these things? I'm not trained in, but when I was going through the sort of process to be received into the Catholic Church, our then priest would say, remember, the Catholic Church is also about tradition. It's not only about scripture. They're both equally important, and the Church existed before anyone wrote a word of the New Testament. The New Testament comes out of the Church as much as being the preparer for it. So they're both important, and just because you find the Bible perhaps difficult to engage with doesn't mean that shouldn't be a block. It can come. It's not the only thing, I would say, that's important in the journey.
Chris, and then I'll take so Chris.
Thank you. Thank you for coming. Much appreciated tonight. Couple of things. One thing that we picked up on earlier, where we talked about bringing our religion out into public. You being seen in the House of Lords as a Christian, me being seen as a Christian in my work as an engineer, for instance. And one of the things that I have noticed that in our own little tricks and ways that we try and bring our faith out for people to see, like you said, 10, 20 years ago, oh, he's a God buggerer. That it wasn't rude, it was just a case of just dismiss it. What I'm finding nowadays is I'm finding that people ask questions more. They're more interested. They don't shut you down anymore. They don't always, now God, no, go away. They actually start little conversations if they know you are a Christian, and they start probing your beliefs. And that's just the point that I've seen a change over the last 20 years. But going along with that, I try and bring my faith to, and I'm in a different sphere than an evangelist. I'm in a very conservative group of people at work, and we're all very traditional engineers. So you do it subtly and gently, and you sort of weigh Christianity, but not too much in your face. How do you do that in the House of Lords, and your business in politics, and of course when you're at home relaxing and at friends? How do you wear your Christianity? How do you display your faith to other people?
I mean, not very well, I think this is the answer. I think, for me, I can drop it into like the public positioning in the Lords, and then people can kind of pick me up on it if they want. I found that a lot of people still can't look for me personally, can't look beyond the, what they believe to be the established public persona of this sort of rather brutish British nationalist who likes sort of giving foreigners a kicking, and that's the sort of that's the profile they bring, and so they find me talking about Christianity a bit jarring, I think, and it doesn't necessarily land well. I think though I'm not very good at trying this myself, is a good way is to have just a kind of something that gives the opportunity for a conversation. Like I notice some other people in the Lords wearing the fish badge or a little cross, so it just gives you, okay, I can talk to this person if I want to. They don't have to kind of prompt, and I think that's probably quite useful.
A bit like the Masons, isn't it?
yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
We'll go there. we had. Let's go on. Joanna.
Thanks, I want to start out with the thanks actually both to Irreverent and to you, Lord Frost, because in the dark days of lockdown, and as my husband, who's a Jewish Christian, says, the Meshugas, is that this was just a light, a beacon of light. It really was. It gave us hope. And I speak for friends who are here as well. It really did give us hope. And then, of course, your appearance just gave, forgive me, Daniel, gave another veneer of genuineness when you came on. But that sense of evil growing in society, growing in the UK, I found to be increasingly palpable over the years. And you mentioned Rod Dreher. This morning I was watching a video he recommended on his Substack called Remnants, and it's about people who have collected, they've gone the Benedict option, and they've set up a community in Lolland, in southern Denmark, essentially because they perceived that the evil, wherever they came from, largely Copenhagen, but also Iceland, that the evil was just so all-pervasive that all they could do was to set up their own community and produce lots of children, produce their own food, and educate their own children, etc. I sometimes feel like that about London, frankly. I just wonder to myself sometimes whether London is lost. and whether one does stay and fight, or in fact do the Benedict option and find somewhere.
Gosh, I think. What do I think? I mean, I as you mentioned, I was ambassador in Denmark, and I like Denmark a lot. It is an extremely secular society in its culture, and I could absolutely get, some of the things that people on that video say and why they wanted to find a way, a different way. I do think there's quite a lot in the Benedict option. I wouldn't myself say, any bit of Britain is lost in that sense. But I think, I certainly have, days where I just want to kind of retreat from what I'm doing and, live a different sort of life. And, sometimes that's just a bit of a sort of fantasy, and sometimes I feel it's responding to some currents. So I do think that, the Benedict option is a kind of important way of preserving important things in Christianity, just as monasticism was, I suppose, in the early Middle Ages. But it's kind of not the only thing. But I mean, what do you think?
Well, though he's not a theological bedfellow, Sam Wells, I think, has written a book on a kind of monastic tradition within the cities. That and Christianity in the early church flourished in the cities as much as it did in the rural areas, often countering opposition and all sorts of forces of darkness and whatnot. And people lived out, they got on with the ordinary, and they made what was around them beautiful, and that became magnetic. And maybe the way that we move forward in some, if we're in difficult areas, suburbs that feel challenging, that we just in our own good way try to create spaces of extending that peace that is within us. Just being, particularly civilized, generous, kindly, walking the extra mile. That those little things. There's a viral YouTube that's gone around a few months ago of a guy cleaning up graffiti and repainting a wall of his own cost, just off his own back. And you watch him, you think, oh, why aren't I doing that? Why? It's, if we're a Christian and we see litter, we should pick it up.
Yeah.
We should try and create and curate beauty around us, I think.
Who is it? I can't remember. Was it P.J. O'Rourke said, everybody wants to save the world and nobody wants to do the washing up. So, there's a bit in there. There was one other thing I wanted to say in response to your question, which is this thing about, and I mentioned in my own speech, the force of evil, if you like, in society. I remember Jamie saying that, I think, in one of the podcasts. And I think, that element of supernaturalism is the most difficult thing to talk about and be taken seriously. But it is a logical, if you believe in supernaturalism, if you believe there's something beyond this world, then you must, as a matter of logic, believe these things. Therefore, you can't retreat from it. But it is the most difficult thing to say without being seen as sort of eccentric in some way. And yet, it's not, one can't retreat from it, I think.
Daniel, I think the book you're referring to is The City is My Monastery. This is by Richard Carter.
Sorry.
And they turned it into a Lent study course, which I attended. It was brilliant, but then they interrupted it because of the lockdown.
Let's read it. Put it on the circulate the reading.
It wasn't Sam.
Yeah.
Firstly, thank you very much for your talk and for arranging all this. It's been most interesting. I do agree that there was an eruption of B1 in the world in 2020. Several people have said exactly that, and that's the way I've described it in the past. But I also think that, in my own experience, that there is a return to there is something going on. I think there's always been an interest. So about 50 years ago in the Channel, they put out 200 tracks and copies of the sermon. So visitors would come in, they'd all be gone the next the next Sunday. So there was always that interest, that low was an interest. But there is something else going on now. And last year, 2 people at work came to me and we started talking about the Bible. I said, would you like to have a read through it? And they said, yes. So once a week we sit down and we just slowly read through. I read ahead and explain what's going on, pointing out things. And I take the time to point out certain unusual things I've picked up. So after the 10 Commandments, for example, what's the next law? It's not about government. It's about the slaves, the rights of the slaves. So you go from here are the 10 Commandments to here are the rights of the poor. So God understands that the poor have to have these certain protections. They're that close intact. And so when you look at society, you can look at society just as a doctor or as an individual. It's not just the physical harm. It's the whole lifestyle, the mind, body, the spirit all together. And a society or in a nation, you have government, the rulers, you have society, and you also have God. And again, you've got 3 working together, and they've got to work together. And so when they start reading through this with the young people, they start pointing these things out. And then we take a step back, you see what's going on in the wider world. I love Pennsylvania last year, 2 centimeters. All of history would have been different. We are, in these days, living through what we are seeing God in action in a way that I've never seen before in my life. God is moving and we must move with him. So I will encourage you definitely to make the most of this time while the nations are attuned. Don't hold that.
I was minded of what you said earlier on, which I had thought about before, about that there is this sort of an ideology of utilitarianism. I was thinking of spreadsheets, and how so much of contemporary life has become reduced down to us being numbers, and that everything has become super digital, mechanical, a certain efficiency that is going rampant is despiritualizing us. That you can go to a restaurant now and order your meal on screen and not meet a human being and sit in a corner, and it's okay, it's fast, but it's one less contact with another soul, and God's made us to be connected to each other. And there is this this sense of the efficient machine is. People, I think, are picking up that we want more. We want contact. We want to break bread. We want to have fun. We want to dance. We want to talk. And yet, contemporary life, all this efficiency is seemingly squashing us.
Yeah.
And draining something that. And I think there's a response, in the last 4 or 5 years, to folks saying, I want more. I want something that's not just the meager offering that is being given. So.
Yeah, I know, I agree, and yet some of it seems, efficient but weird, and that's really the problem. And AI, you kind of touched on it, is a kind of exemplar of this, I think, where so much of the it's a convenient tool, but it takes out so much of the kind of human element to doing tasks, thinking about things. You get this absurd situations where, one person gets AI to write an email, the other person gets it, uses AI to summarize it, and you kind of eliminate sort of the actual people in the process entirely, and the machines are talking to each other. And, I'm not a sort of technophobe. I think, all these things have their place, but I do think AI is kind of crystallizing for some people. It certainly is for me, a sort of artificiality in the way we do things that probably we need to make a particular effort to move away from or not get captured by.
I can't source a statistic, but I believe that, and this is really a criticism particularly of the guys, that more men downloaded a virtual girlfriend on a subscription plan in the UK this year and got on their knees and got a wedding ring. You think of that, more people are having a virtual relationship than actually proposed marriage.
Yeah, I suspect we'll find this sort of thing is much more common than we think, actually, and people don't admit to it. What's depressing, Phil?
Yeah. Going back to the secular utilitarianism, if you look at the demographic changes over the next 20 years, do you think that secular utilitarianism will be the way to stop multiculturalism descending into sectarianism?
Gosh, there's a lot in that question. I think, I think secular utilitarianism is sold, or rather the supposedly value-free public space is sold as a way of, people with very different values and ideas being able to live together without rubbing up against each other. And as I say, I feel that's a bit oversold in its own terms. So I think it really works like that. I do not think that secular utilitarianism is capable in itself of kind of binding together a multicultural society, because it doesn't have any of the sort of effective effective bonds that bring people together. It's purely about kind of cost benefits. It allows only a very restricted frame of reference, and it doesn't allow for many of the things that make humans, make countries, make kind of ideas. And I think that's the root of the difficulty. All the most important things are kind of outside the frame of reference by definition. So I that's why I worry. And a society where you've got lots of competing groups, all of whom are a bit too frightened to kind of engage with each other, it does not seem to me to be a very happy society. We should do everything we can to avoid this country getting into that position. That would be my view. And I still think we have lots of things that do bind us. It's just we're kind of reluctant to talk about them quite often, or really bring them into a political conversation. I don't think things are as bad as a lot of people say, but they're still a lot worse than they were 20 years ago, and we need to try and turn that trend round, in my view.
One last question.
So again, with you, conversation, I think I'm really enjoyed it a lot. I'm not the person I found it really exciting. Okay, I just wanted to know, obviously in the Bible it says we should respect the authority, not the government. But given that what's happening in this country, and given that the United Kingdom protests and all that against the current government, this is for both of you, how as Christians should be respond to it, like not non-violent way, like Tommy Robinson's marches where people get injured, but also in a way that will accept that evil that's come upon us.
Gosh, I think I think a number of things about that. So I think we however bad one's government is in a democratic society, it's still better than not having an effective government. And we kind of, we owe our rulers, even if we don't agree with them, a degree of kind of benefit of the doubt that they're trying to do the right thing, and keeping the show on the road is quite important. And where you look at countries where the show hasn't been kept on the road, it's an important element of government. So although it's right, obviously, to criticize what the government does and debate it and, even demonstrate if one wishes, I do think that, we, in a democratic country, basically, democratic politics is the right way through this, and we should be understanding and be content to be ruled. Now, I think one of the problems we've got into in this country is that, and this is a sort of slightly political point, I admit, but is that the government has become very all-pervasive, and it's come to feel like you can't kind of really live your life unless you or do certain projects or pursue certain things, unless you kind of willing to go along with the current ideology. You have to sort of pay lip service to it. You have to be content to be regulated, and the kind of free space to do things where, it may be a bad government, but you don't really care about what they think, so you're just getting on with your life. That space has shrunk quite a bit, I think, over the last 20 or 30 years, and we should be trying to sort of expand it out. And I'm not suggesting, Jesus saying, render unto Caesar, whatever. I'm not saying that's the entire meaning of what he was saying, but it certainly isn't. But I think part of what he was saying is the government is the government, you owe it your obligation, but there's a lot of other stuff in your own life and how you live it that is just as important. And I think we live in a society where the government is increasingly trying to squeeze that and make it difficult for our own best interests. That's the problem. It's not that we live under a totalitarian regime, it's that we live under people who wish us well and won't stop trying to make us well. And that's been part of the problem. We need to widen out the freedom to pursue our own projects, get on their own lives, and then what we think about the government won't matter quite so much.
I think, remember why C.S. Lewis in his essay *The Abolition of Man* picks up upon that he thought it would be better to be under the reign of the robber baron than the sort of tyrannical well-meaning.
Yes.
I've not quoted it correctly.
Yes.
Accurately there, but I suspect Huxley's Brave New World is more prophetic than Orwell's. That a world where we can have everything on tap actually it can have an authoritarian element in it. It's sort of just the nature of it. But it can also spiritually make us very sick. And becomes, in that particular book, a Christianity without tears. It's sort of dislocated from the great tradition, but it's got some of the veneer of the idea of everybody getting as much as they can of what they need. But if you put a child in a sweet shop and say have everything, they'll be sick at the end. So that a sort of spiritual malaise develops in the same way. So I think we can be critical of society in that way, as Lord Frost has said. But that would be my sense, is that we're being squashed and squeezed by kindness. We're meaningless.
Yes, that's what I feel.
But it's too much.
Yeah. And because original sin and the world being what it is, if that's a government's plan, it's never going to succeed. They're never going to get to achieve what they want to do and make us perfect and make society work really well. It's just not going to happen. And therefore you need to be governed by people who aren't going to try that, rather than people who are going to try it endlessly.
Steve at the back, you had your hand up.
Oh yeah, just to slightly change the balance on trust, you've been a diplomat. I think all of us here would share to some extent in the feeling that maybe there's a gathering storm in international affairs as well as internally. Now, I'm not going to use land fever or anything like that, but I just wondered what your thoughts were about where this situation might be going and on what time scale and what the kind of things as a foreign officer insights you might have.
I mean, my view of what's going on in the world is that it's this kind of reversion to the norm, and actually to a large extent still always been the norm. And I think a lot of people believe in a kind of this sort of fantasy construct of the rules-based system where everybody abided by the rules, and to an extent they did that in the last 20 or 30 years as the Cold War ended. But the reason they did it was because American power, to a very large extent, stopped, discouraged people from doing anything different. They were the hegemon, and everyone had to adjust to the Americans in some way. Now that world is changing. There are other powers, the Chinese, the Indians, even the Russians to some extent still in their own way. And the world is great powers rubbing up against each other to a much greater extent. And, you can't always fight a world war just because, some great power wants to assert itself in its neighborhood. So to some extent, you have to kind of find a way of accommodating to this reality that doesn't constantly produce existential confrontation. And I don't know that we found a way of doing that. We did kind of do it in the Cold War, I suppose, with the binary, but it was very risky period at times, and we have to find a way of being pragmatic about foreign policy, I think, that doesn't make everything existential all the time. There's a subordinate question about what Europeans do in this world. Is Europe power in its own right or not? But so I worry, because I think, human frailty is that, you get into confrontations, you make mistakes, things don't go as you expect, and then things go from bad to worse. And I wish, our leaders, all our leaders, were just a bit kind of more careful. I think that's kind of what I would wish to see, which is obviously a counsel of perfection, but it's even more plausible than the idea that there's going to be some universal global legislator that's going to kind of control every country and make them act well that way. Seems less likely.
Well, I think we can conclude on a diplomat's words. Lord Frost, David, thank you very much for coming to speaking to our first event tonight. I think we can be very grateful for your insight and wisdom. Can we please give